This system became known as fractional reserve banking and was later transported to the early American colonies. It formed the root of American commercial banking and ultimately the Federal Reserve System.
This is a fraudulent system. It's not allowed in any other business. If you had a grain warehouse that had loaned out the grain it was supposed to have in storage, that's considered criminal. They've got to go to jail. But the banks are the one industry that's allowed to get away with this and to profit from it.
Alexander Hamilton became the first Treasury Secretary and in 1791 set up the first Bank of the United States as America's central bank to expand the supply of paper money for the benefit of the government and the commercial banks.
Alexander Hamilton believed in a strong central government, and he saw a central bank as one of the means by which the government could be centralized and by which its power could be expressed.
Thomas Jefferson opposed this view. He saw a central bank as an undemocratic tool of the northeastern banking establishment. It was dismantled after 20 years.
Jefferson was an opponent of a strong central government and at all costs wanted to remove the central bank.
In 1816, the federal government made another attempt to set up an inflationary central bank. But this second Bank of the United States was denounced by President Andrew Jackson as a monster bank for benefiting a few at the expense of many.
They inflated the money supply, which brought about a boom initially, that is prosperity to the country, followed by a bust. When they stopped inflating the money supply, many businesses that had depended on the low interest rates that were introduced or induced by the initial inflation went out of business.
Jackson succeeded in abolishing the second central bank in 1836. But by then, speculators had set up hundreds of new private banks with little or no gold to back the notes they issued. The nation's monetary system became more stable when the United States introduced a gold standard in 1834. The dollar was worth approximately 1/20th of an ounce of gold.
The gold standard was understood by the founding fathers, by Andrew Jackson and others, as being a money of the people. That is, it was a hard money, a money that could not be tampered with, that could not be inflated to permit government expenditures skyrocketing.
But by 1862, Abraham Lincoln needed to fund his invasion of the South. So once again, the government began to print up paper money.
Basically, the United States went off the gold standard in order to finance the Civil War. Okay. And you'll find in history that almost every large war, every major war, has involved a departure from the gold standard. Because the gold standard put strict limits on government financing.
Lincoln's notes became known as greenbacks because they were printed in green ink rather than the usual black ink on the reverse side. These so-called fiat notes were deemed legal tender by the government, but they were not redeemable in gold.
Lincoln, under cover of war, issued a tremendous number of greenbacks. Gold was still circulating. The people were forced to accept these greenbacks as if they were a par with gold.
The government's power to print unbacked paper notes would later become the pillar of the Federal Reserve System. After the Civil War, the nation's monetary system became sounder when the U.S. adopted a gold standard.
We went back on the gold standard in 1879 and had probably the greatest period of growth and of prosperity ever in the country's history.
For nearly 20 years, the total output of goods and services grew at an unprecedented rate of 4% per year.
The reason being that with a sound money and without the ability to manipulate the interest rate, we had a lot of genuine saving and investment, which then led to more capital goods and higher labor productivity in the United States.
In the midst of this prosperity, the big industrialists and financiers were plotting to expand their empires with the help of government. With the passage of the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, the large railroads succeeded in blocking their smaller competitors through regulation.
The ICC was put in place in order to protect the railroad owners from competition. It was not the case that it was going to protect consumers or shippers. In fact, consumers were hurt because ultimately, with higher railroad rates, they were forced to pay higher prices for the goods and services that were shipped across the country.
By 1896, they were poised to do the same thing with the banks. Two camps emerged as leaders in this economic war. They were led by J.P. Morgan, the world's most powerful private banker, and John D. Rockefeller, the oil tycoon. Morgan and Rockefeller were great adversaries, but despite their business differences, they both favored a central bank. They wanted cheap credit and an inflated money supply to finance the expansion of their empires. Together, they led the campaign to sell the idea to the American public, which later led to the founding of the Federal Reserve.
If the American people got wind of the fact that this bank was not in their interests, in fact, they understood that it was in the interests of the financial elites who would use it to inflate the money supply and in doing so increase their own revenues, they would have been held to pay. Legislation would never pass under those conditions. So it had to be sold to the American people as a way of making their currency more elastic.
So I wanted to show that just to give an introduction to the issue of what the gold standard is, what a little bit about the banking system is. The movie was for the United States. I'm sure you realize. So it is slightly different in Canada, but the basic principles are still there. In Canada, we have a central bank. It's called the Bank of Canada. It functions the same way as what they have in the United States called the Federal Reserve. It's the same type of deal. You have one bank at the center of the system that all of the other banks, the ones that we use, CIBC, RBC, TD, they, all of them need to keep an account with the central bank. And if these private banks need to borrow money, they borrow from the central bank. They can only use the pieces of paper that are printed by the central bank that we know as our money, our $5, $10 bill. And they also follow the regulations of the central bank. So that's sort of the brief summary of the banking system. There's a few issues that the movie went into that just want to take a moment to clarify. There were two individuals that they mentioned there. I don't know if anyone caught the name, J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller. One of the reasons I like the video is because it goes straight to these two. And if you look further into the issue and you look sort of more in detail of the history of banking, you see that what we don't have is an evolution of our money. I think maybe it's a generalization, but my experience through school has been that the gold standard was presented as, well, I'm in economics, so maybe people have never heard of the gold standard before, but let's say the gold standard was presented as something that they used to do when horses and wagons were around. And then, you know, as we got more refined, we moved to, evolved into the paper money system. And it's just sort of the natural of working with banks. But as you look into the history, you see that individuals like J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller, and there's others, and I'll be mentioning their names. Another big one is Amschel Rothschild. These are individuals that, with an agenda, financed and lobbied governments around the world, actually, England, Canada, the United States, Australia, to get onto central banks, to get onto our current paper money system. They've I don't want to say they've done illegal things, but it's just heavy lobbying to get onto these things. It's not like the people decided one day that this would be better for everybody. This is rich, elite bankers that decided the system they wanted and sold it to the public. We have a very top-down system.